As I look over Revelation 28, I am well aware of the fact that the argument I'm about to make is heavily dependent on other cases that have been put forth in this series. If you disagree with my premises, the symbolic thrust of John's apocalypse, the church being the fulfillment of Israel, the nature of the last days, and our currently being in the tribulation and the millennium, you'll disagree with the case made in this video. If those thoughts cause you pause, please consult earlier episodes. If you're mostly tracking with me through those, let's proceed. If you really want the extra credit, take a quick break from this video and go and read Ezekiel 38 and 39. It's okay, I'll wait. In Revelation 27 through 9 we read, "And when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their numbers like the sand of the sea. And they marched up over the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. But fire came down from heaven and consumed them." We know very little about Gog and Magog apart from here, a quick genealogical reference in Chronicles, and what we read in Ezekiel. From Ezekiel 38 and 39, I'm going to pick certain themes that I think will best establish the case I'm trying to make. Others may highlight different pieces of the passage and arrive at different conclusions, but work with me here. First, we see that Gog will march on Israel in the latter days. Gog and his hordes will be like a cloud covering the land. When Gog marches on Israel, there will be a great earthquake. God will destroy Gog with sword, pestilence, bloodshed, torrential rains, hailstones, fire, and sulfur. And the birds and the beasts will devour the fallen soldiers. Don't worry, we'll come back to these in a minute. Before we go further, I would say that there are some who view the Ezekiel chapters as having already been fulfilled. They see the enemies in Ezekiel and Revelation as different. An easy dissimilarity to latch onto is that they distinguish between Gog coming from the north and Gog and Magog coming from all corners of the earth in Ezekiel and Revelation respectively. Now I find that argument somewhat thin and take Ezekiel 37 and 38 as being the conclusive end-time battle that takes place in the latter days. Dr. Beale refers to the differences in locale and scope in terms of the universalization of the Old Testament text. Just as we universalize as encompassing the church under the New Covenant, so we can understand specific nations as representing all the antagonistic world powers in John's apocalypse. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's consider these comments again from Ezekiel. In Revelation 28, we have Gog and Magog being like the sand of the sea. Now this is not a direct parallel to the cloud, but it is interesting. They are marching out to surround the camp of the saints, just as Gog was to march against Israel in the latter days. The explicit references to Gog and Magog in chapter 20 are somewhat few, so let's pan out a little bit more. When the seventh bowl is poured out in Revelation 16, which we're arguing is the same event as this last battle, there is a great earthquake. Gog and Magog are destroyed with fire from heaven, and that seventh bowl brings great hailstones. That could be developed far more, but we'll leave it at that for now. In another account of the last battle in Revelation 19, the angel calls for the birds of the air to consume the bodies of all of the fallen. To change prophets, Zechariah also talks about the last battle. Just to reference a phrase, "I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle." Revelation 20 verse 9 specifically says that this last battle will surround the beloved city. Now we are persuaded that the most natural reading of Ezekiel, Zechariah, and Revelation leads us to the conclusion that the prophets are addressing the day of the Lord, the end of this age. Now many spot connections between the testaments. The question is what we're supposed to do with them. Some have resorted to claiming that Revelation 27 through 9 take place before a literal millennium. These are respectable scholars who are much brighter than I am. Still, this approach strikes me as inconsistent. I think for most folks, though, the question is, well, where are Gog and Magog? There's sometimes an attempt to try to identify the political, geographical entities who will symbolically, again, bear these names in the last times. Now, it would be foolish to ignore what certainly seem like physical cues in the biblical text. The very presence of these cues seems to suggest specific tactile origins of these enemies of God. My question is about the whole notion of what I like to think of as prophetic geography. Let's establish some premises again. First, if Revelation is mostly symbolic, which doesn't mean it's not real, but rather deliberately apocalyptically illustrative, if the church is God's temple, Check out the New Testament. If the saints of 20 verse 9 really are the saints, and unless something happens that every single believer in Jesus will converge on a narrow strip of land in the Middle East right before the Battle of Armageddon, it seems reasonable to assume that Jerusalem as such is symbolic. Jerusalem, we can piece together from Galatians and Hebrews, is the home of the saints. If Jerusalem then is representative, it also seems reasonable to assume that Gog and Magog are representative of the enemies of God from every quarter of the earth. This is actually agreed on by many folks who don't share our particular understanding of Revelation. Now, we see the approach that we've just given you as taking things the next biblical unlogical step. If there is only one final battle against God's people, let's check out the last episodes, then Gog and Magog are not to be located in Russia or Saudi Arabia or China or even the United States. At the end of this age, Satan will be given the authority to gather all the nations against God's people. He will be released from his prison at that time. However, Satan's deception in Revelation 20:7 and 8 is only part of the story. In Ezekiel 38:4, God says to Gog, "And I will turn you about and put hooks into your jaws, and I will bring you out, and all your army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed in full armor, a great host, all of them with buckler and shield, wielding swords." God drags them out, and then the text says he shows his glory. Scripture puts forth that God will summon his enemies to march on his people, and then will violently, gloriously, and conclusively condemn them to eternal torment. Not just a couple of nations, but all of those who stand against him and against the camp of his saints.